what all are we about to get into?
We'll be talking about some really exciting arguments for the truth of Christianity, in particular the resurrection and the conversion and miracles of Paul, which you may not be familiar with, even if you're familiar with some of the popular talking points that you'll see from people like William Lane Craig or Gary Habermas. A lot of these arguments will most likely be new to you. We'll be talking about how the resurrection case, and indeed the argument from the conversion and miracles of Paul, relate to the case for the high historicity or reliability of the Gospels and the book of Acts.
Folks, all I got to say is get your notepads out, because this goes deep. It goes granular. There's a lot of different data points that get tied in here. And it was really a pleasure, Dr. McClatchy. Thanks so much for coming on and having this conversation. We just had it, but you guys are about to enjoy it. I just want to play like a minute or so of this just to kind of get people onto the same page of what are the objections, what are we talking about here? And then at whatever point you feel like, okay, we get it, just say pause, and I'll pause it, and then we can roll from there.
Because of this claim that they say they saw Jesus resurrected. Like there's something different that goes on there, that they're like, this is a miracle, right? Dead people don't usually rise from the dead.
So what is your personal belief when it comes to the resurrection? What do you think happened? Do you have a belief, or do you just try to interpret the text and try to see what is the message?
Well, I think, so as a historian, I do think it is a historical question. You have a guy who objectively lived, he objectively died, and then individuals close to his inner circle claim that they see him not dead.
Right.
Again.
This is a highly unusual activity.
Highly unusual.
Right. So, but it's hard when you're dealing with illiterate populations, you're dealing with thousands of years of time, you're dealing with an oral tradition, and then you have us sitting here talking about it in 2024, trying to figure it at the end of 2024, trying to figure this out. Literally the end.
Yeah.
Last couple of days. It's very difficult for anybody who thinks of themselves as an intelligent person who's secular to even entertain the possibility that someone died and come back to life.
And I get that. But we've already talked about the fact that we don't think that the only thing that exists is matter and motion. We as in you and I, right? Like we believe that there's something else going on in this world that's a little bit crazy.
There's something else.
And that to, I think, exclude that, I think excludes something that you're kind of putting blinders on. For. And you do have, I mean, you're right in terms of all of these ancient conventions and the ways that things were spread around. But the Gospels are written in the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. And they're written in this period of time where you have groups of individuals who could have fact-checked those things. So
how do you fact-check someone coming back from the dead?
Well,
how many people saw his body, right?
Well, Paul says that 400 people saw him all at once.
400 people saw the crucifixion?
No, saw the resurrected Jesus. Yeah, 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says that Jesus appeared to the disciples, and then he appeared to 400 people all at once. I mean, if we read the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Luke and Acts, so same author wrote these both documents, he says that Jesus was walking around teaching them for 40 days after he was resurrected from the dead. And so these are written within a time period when you have people who would have seen Jesus' ministry, who were there, say, at something like the feeding of the 5,000, who could have been able to verify or debunk some of these things that are being said. And you go from a bunch of scared guys who, because Jesus wasn't the only messianic figure who arose and claimed to be the Messiah.
Right.
There were a number of individuals both prior to and after Jesus, but they die and the movement dies with them.
Yeah, I mean, it's not the point that I would want to emphasize when developing the case for the resurrection. I mean, I can go into the arguments that I would emphasize if you want. But
yeah, I would love to hear the difference. So when you say that, which point in particular are you referring to or thinking of?
Well, I'm not saying that these points are not significant. I just don't think that these aren't the arguments I'd want to lead with when making the case for the resurrection.
Okay, so I want to hear where you would take it or what you would lead with.
Sure. So The case for the resurrection that I would develop, and I know Wes is on board with this approach as well, is what we call the maximal data argument, which is essentially a two-step argument. The first step being to establish that the accounts that we have in the Gospels and the Book of Acts actually represent the testimony of the alleged witnesses. And there's a torrent of evidence to establish that contention, which I'm happy to get into. That being the case, we have to evaluate what best explains the set of testimonies that we find in the Gospels and Acts pertaining to the content of the resurrection encounters. And when we're evaluating any set of testimonial claims, there are basically three broad explanatory categories that could give an account of why the claim was made. In particular, the claimant is lying, or the claimant is sincerely mistaken, or else the content of the claim is true. Now, when it comes to the hypothesis that the apostles were lying, that doesn't seem to accord particularly well with the context of the claim. In particular, and I'll quote here from William Paley, who published a book in 1794 called A View of the Evidences of Christianity. And he spends the first 9 chapters defending the following proposition, that there was satisfactory evidence that many, professing to be original witnesses of the Christian miracles, passed their lives in labors, dangers, and sufferings, voluntarily undergone in attestation of the accounts which they delivered, and so in consequence of their belief of those accounts, and that they also submitted from the same motives to new rules of conduct, right? And again, there's a torrent of evidence to establish that context of persecution, and in particular, that the apostles themselves underwent hardships, sufferings, imprisonments, in some cases death, that they endured perpetual dangers on account of their contention that Christ had been raised from the dead. And the truth of Christianity. And that goes a long way towards establishing their sincerity, because people are unlikely to endure hardships and sufferings and persecutions, imprisonments, or death on account of something they believe to be false. And so that then shifts the discussion to the question of how did the apostles come to sincerely arrive at the conclusion that they'd had encounters with Jesus after his death. And when we inspect the content of the claim, it's not the sort of set of claims about which one is plausibly sincerely mistaken. Bear in mind that we're assuming as background that the accounts in the Gospels and Acts actually do represent the testimony of the alleged witnesses, which of course I'm happy to come back and defend. It's not the sort of set of claims about which one is plausibly sincerely mistaken. The encounters are to groups as well as individuals. It involves group conversations with Jesus, physical contact with Jesus on multiple occasions. Jesus eats and drinks with the disciples on multiple occasions, including an episode when he cooks breakfast for 7 disciples on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. It involves extended discourses with Jesus. It involves passing Jesus objects, like the broiled fish passed to Jesus in Luke 24. It's according to Acts 1:3, it's over a 40-day time period. So we're not just dealing with one brief and confusing episode. It's in different settings and contexts. It's in Jerusalem and Galilee, indoors and out of doors, without prior appointment and with prior appointment. It's really difficult to envision one being sincerely mistaken about that sort of set of claims. And so since it's neither plausible that the apostles were lying, nor that they were sincerely mistaken, the best explanation is that the content of what they alleged is in fact true. So that's a summary of the case for the resurrection as I would defend it. And of course, the most crucial aspect of that case is establishing that the accounts that we have in the Gospels and Acts actually represent the testimony of the alleged witnesses, which is what I'd spend the majority of my time defending when putting forward that argument.
Okay, and that is quite helpful. I was going to ask you, in your experience with talking to people through your job, ministry, however you want to put it, talkaboutdoubts.com, is the most common follow-up question or line of questions that you'll get the one that you just said, where people say, yeah, but how do we trust these sources? How do we know that what we're reading is a reflection of what really took place? Or are there other objections that you'll face?
Yeah, so just for those who don't know about my ministry, so talkaboutdoubts.com is a ministry that I have been doing for a number of years, where we offer private mentoring to Christians who struggle with doubts about faith. We also talk to former Christians who want to explore the evidence for Christianity to determine whether there perhaps is a rational path back to faith. We also talk to people who are not Christians, who are simply exploring the evidence for Christianity. And the way it works is we have a team of around 80 volunteer specialists in various academic fields, biblical archaeology, textual criticism, New Testament scholarship, Old Testament, philosophical theology, philosophy, epistemology. We have psychologists and pastors on the team. We have people who are in the natural sciences, both physical and life sciences, and so forth. And so whatever area people have that they struggle with in regards to doubt, we try to pair them with a specialist who's an expert in that particular subject. And calls are often one-on-one or two-on-one. And we also have a Discord community that we invite past inquirers to join. And we also have an emotional support group and a book club for past inquirers as well. So that's a little bit about the background. The topic of the resurrection comes up fairly often. Oftentimes, unfortunately, we find that people are not very well acquainted with the positive case for Christianity. People tend to get fixated on objections that they don't have satisfactory answers to, and because they're so fixated on these objections, they miss sight of the avalanche of positive evidence for the truth of Christianity. This is what Richard Whately, a 19th century Christian philosopher, called the fallacy of objections, where one becomes so fixated on objections that one misses sight of the forest for the trees. So yeah, the resurrection is a very common topic that comes up, and the resurrection, of course, is only one of several major lines of argument for Christianity that we would defend. Others would include the conversion of Paul, the Christological trilemma, messianic prophecy, and modern miracles, and so forth.
That's fantastic. And so going kind of back to the sort of the positive case for the resurrection, just to kind of recap this or sort of phrase this to make sure that everyone's on the same page here. So you're saying that it's unlikely that the disciples were lying because they have really not a great reason to do so, and the record doesn't really indicate that.
That's
also,
exactly right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then the second point then would be that they are unlikely to have been mistaken given the amount of appearances of Jesus that they encountered of a wide variety and over a long period of time. So it's not like Bigfoot. I think I saw the blurry creature in the forest one time, although the moon was kind of, crescent, and I'm not really sure what I saw. Maybe it was Jesus. You're saying this is not like that at all. This is repeated, multiply attested to, and in a variety of different circumstances over a long period of time.
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's a good summary of the argument. Obviously, there's a lot more detail that can be unpacked there, but that's the most condensed form of the argument for the resurrection.
Okay, and then you're saying that the primary, so then the third option would be they actually did experience a risen Christ. Jesus actually did appear to them, actually did eat fish with, cook fish for Peter on the shore, et cetera, et cetera. They really did put their fingers into his side. Doubting Thomas really did do that. And then you were kind of alluding to, though, that a top objection that you'll get to kind of jumping to that is people will say, well, how do we know that any of these accounts are real? These are just stories. These are from thousands of years ago. These are just like mythology stories. I don't believe in Harry Potter in a literal sense, and I don't believe in any of these magical stories that you're trying to convince me of from the first century. And how would you respond to that type of objection? Because I'll be honest, I hear that a lot.
That's a great question. And for that, we'd appeal to numerous lines of both internal and external evidences that confirm that the Gospels and Acts are composed by individuals who are very well informed, very close up to the facts, and in the habit of being truthful. And as I said before, there's a torrent of evidence to establish this, and we can get into some of the details. I'll just share my screen here again. Okay, here we go. So let's start with the Gospels. And maybe we'll come to Acts a bit later. So let's go to the Gospel of Mark, for example. So let's go to chapter 6. And here we have an account concerning the imprisonment and execution of John the Baptist. And Mark says, it was Herod who had sentenced John and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because he had married her. For John had been saying to Herod, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. So according to Mark, and you can also find a parallel account of this in Matthew 14 and also in Luke 3, The reason why Herod has John the Baptist imprisoned is because of John's persistent complaints against Herod's adulterous affair with Herodias. Right? Now, he said it's not lawful for you to have your brother's wife, and so Herod doesn't like this and has John the Baptist imprisoned. Now, Josephus, who was a first century Jewish historian, he wrote a 20-volume set called Antiquities of the Jews between around 93, 94 AD. He writes in Antiquities of the Jews about this adulterous affair that Herod had with Herodias. And he tells us that in order to marry Herodias, Herod Antipas divorced himself from his previous wife, and this actually resulted in a war between Herod Antipas and his former father-in-law, Aretas IV, king of the Nabateans. And Josephus tells us that Aretas made this the first occasion of his enmity between him and Herod, who had also some quarrel with him about their limits of the country Gemelitis. So they raised armies on both sides and prepared for war, and sent their generals to fight instead of themselves. And when they had joined battle, all Herod's army was destroyed by the treachery of some fugitives who, though they were of the tetrarchy of Philip, joined with Aretas' army. So you can imagine Aretas is pretty ticked off because Herod has divorced Aretas' daughter, and Philip's pretty ticked off because Herod has divorced. Philip has committed adultery with Philip's wife. Okay, so they join forces against Herod, and Herod loses. And it says, so Herod wrote about these affairs to Tiberius, who, being very angry at the attempt made by Aretas, wrote to Vitellius, so he's the legate of Syria at the time, to make war upon him, and either to take him alive and bring him to him in bonds, or to kill him and send him his head. This was a charge that Tiberius gave to the president of Syria, right? So scholars generally date this defeat of Herod's army to around the year 36, because it's shortly before the death of Tiberius, the emperor, in 37. And so John the Baptist's imprisonment and execution would be a few years in the rearview mirror by this point, which makes what Josephus goes on to say next quite striking. He says, now some of the Jews thought the destruction of Herod's army came from God, and that very justly as a punishment of what he did against John that was called the Baptist. For Herod slew him, who was a good man, and commanded the Jews to exercise virtue, both as to righteousness towards one another and piety towards God. And he goes on to talk about the ministry of John the Baptist. And then he adds, now, when many others came in crowds about him, for they were greatly moved or pleased by hearing his words, Herod, who feared lest the great influence John had over the people might put it into his power and inclination to raise a rebellion, for they seemed ready to do anything he should advise, thought it best by putting him to death, to prevent any mischief he might cause, and not bring himself into difficulties by sparing a man who might make him repent of it when it should be too late. Accordingly, he was sent a prisoner out of Herod's suspicious temple to Machaerus, the castle that before mentioned, and was there put to death. Now the Jews had an opinion that the destruction of this army was sent as a punishment upon Herod and a mark of God's displeasure against him. So according to Josephus, there was a rumor among the Jews that Herod's defeat at the hands of his former father-in-law was actually God's hand in judgment against Herod for the way he'd handled the situation a few years earlier with John the Baptist, which makes a lot of sense in light of what we just read in Mark. According to him, the reason why Herod has John imprisoned is because of John's persistent complaints against Herod's adulterous affair with Herodias, which we learn from Josephus is the very affair that caused the war that Herod lost in the first place. Right? So the accounts fit together in a way that makes sense on the historical reportage view of Mark. And it does so in a very incidental and casual and artless way that it supports historicity. Does that make sense, Brandon?
That does make sense. So you're saying basically it's not constructed in a way that is sort of, how would you put it, like post hoc, trying to fit into the other accounts of history in order to come across as history, but it has information inside of it that corroborates with external sources in a way that the author of Mark wouldn't have been able to do. Like, like imagine you're going to go and try to write an account that you're going to try to pass off as history and then fill it with imaginary details. Is the idea that he wouldn't have had access to these, like he wouldn't have had access to Josephus, or
well, Josephus was written later, right? So Josephus was writing around 93, 94 AD, but these are independent sources. For one thing, Josephus and Mark disagree a little bit on why John the Baptist was imprisoned by Herod Antipas. I mean, according to Mark, it's because of Herod's it's because Herod's adulterous affair with Herodias and John's complaints against that. According to Josephus, it was because of Herod's suspicious temper and his fear of an uprising. John the Baptist is getting too popular for Herod's liking, so he has him imprisoned. Now, these aren't mutually exclusive, but it nonetheless does point to independence between Mark and Josephus. And it doesn't, I mean, Josephus, his writing later, isn't trying to fill out the backstory to Mark's gospel. I mean, he doesn't tell us that the reason why Herod has John in prison is because of John's complaints against Herod's adulterous affair with Herodias. But the fact that the Jews are complaining or are saying that Herod's defeat at the hands of his former father-in-law was God's hand in judgment against Herod for the way he'd handled the situation a few years earlier with John the Baptist, it fits with what we see in Mark in an artless, casual, undesigned way.
Yeah.
That supports the historicity of what we're reading in Mark. So if you began listening to this with a low view of the reliability of the Gospels, this isn't going to be sufficient to overturn your view, right? You might still have a low view of the reliability of the Gospels. However, if you're being reasonable, it should move your credence level in a positive direction, right? Every mountain can be broken into tiny motes of dust, but that doesn't mean that the mountain itself isn't heavy, right? So this is the beginning of a massive cumulative case that we draw upon numerous examples, scores and scores and scores of examples like this, that cumulatively demonstrate that these sources are composed by individuals who are extremely well informed, very close up to the facts, and in the habit of being scrupulous. So here's another example. So if we go over to Luke 13, we read the following. It says, "At that very hour, some Pharisees came and said to Jesus, 'Get away from here, for Herod wants to kill you.'" Now, Luke, when he mentions Herod Antipas, he repeatedly emphasizes more than once that he is Tetrarch of Galilee in Luke 3:1, Herod being Tetrarch of Galilee, for example. Now, Jesus at this time in his ministry has actually already left Galilee. We see this from verse 22. He went on his way through towns and villages, teaching and journeying towards Jerusalem. Now, if Jesus has already left Galilee, what sense then is the Pharisees' caution? Get away from here, for Herod wants to kill you. Presumably, he's already outside of Herod's jurisdiction. Well, if we look up Josephus again, he tells us that following the death of Herod the Great, that's this Herod's father, in 4 BC, his territory was divided among 3 of his sons, Archelaus, the eldest, and then Antipas and Philip. And he says, as for the other half, he divided it into 2 parts. He gave it to 2 other Herod's sons, to Philip and to Antipas. That Antipas he disputed with Archelaus for the whole kingdom. Now to him it was that Perea and Galilee paid their tribute, which amounted annually to 200 talents. So not only was Galilee under Herod's jurisdiction, but apparently so was this other region called Perea. Now where's Perea? Well, let me show it on the map here just to get a sense of the geographical bearing.
By the way, while he's pulling this up, if you guys are curious what software Dr. McClatchy is using to keep all of his highlights organized, to be able to go between scholarly articles and Bible references and a bunch more stuff, this is called logos.com. You can check it out for free at logos.com/DDOW. It's helping me get to answers a lot more quickly. Once you see how much it helps you get to the bottom of biblical answers, you're gonna love it. So check that out. The link is in the description. And again, it's logos.com/DDOW. And that gets you 60 days totally free. Just try it, experiment with it, get under the hood of it, and I think you'll see the value there.
Okay, so this is Judea down here in the south. This is Galilee in the north. This is Samaria that lies between Judea and Galilee. This is the Jordan River that flows north to south into the Dead Sea. And this is the region of Perea, which is east of the Jordan River. The region that we just learned was also, in addition to Galilee, under the jurisdiction of Herod Antipas. In fact, this is the castle of Machaerus that we just read about in Josephus, where John the Baptist was imprisoned. So with that information in mind, let's go back to Luke. Now, Luke doesn't inform us of where geographically this caution of the Pharisees takes place. But if you consult the other Gospels, we learn that at this very time, Jesus is spending time in Perea, east of the Jordan River. So Matthew 19, for example, says, "Now when Jesus had finished these sayings, he went away from Galilee and entered the region of Judea beyond the Jordan," which would be the region of Perea, right? And so there you have a coincidence involving Luke, the other 3 Gospels, and Josephus that help to explain Luke 13:31, because Jesus is in fact in Perea, a detail not supplied by Luke. And Luke, when he mentions Herod Antipas, he only emphasizes him being Tetrarch of Galilee. He doesn't mention that he's also a Tetrarch of Perea. And so this fits together in a very casual, incidental, and undesigned way that again supports the historicity of the narrative in Luke. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. And does that also basically become a strong line of evidence against the idea that these were written, way later by, anonymous people or people in whatever, Italy in the 4th century or whatever, something like that? You sometimes hear these ideas that these are basically what you're supporting is that the author of Mark was there on the scene at the time in order to be able to get all this information, correct?
Yeah, so it's evidence that whoever wrote the Gospels, it has to look something very much like traditional authorship. And I could make a case for traditional authorship. I think traditional authorship is correct. But leaving traditional authorship to one side for a moment, whoever wrote the Gospels is going to look something very much like traditional authorship, just on the basis of these numerous points of historical confirmation of these sources. To take another example, in Mark 14, Jesus is at his trial before Caiaphas, and it says, many bore false witness against him, but their testimony did not agree. And some stood up and bore false witness against him, saying, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands. Even about this, their testimony did not agree. Now, nothing in Mark provides the backstory or a pretext for this allegation. The reader's just left hanging. And in the context of 1st century Judea, this is a really serious allegation. It's not the sort of thing you want to make jokes about, right? Saying you're going to destroy the temple. But as I said, there's nothing in Mark that explains what Jesus said. It doesn't look like a whole cloth fabrication on the part of these false witnesses, particularly in view of the specificity of 3 days and also the fact they can't quite agree on what Jesus said. Also, when Jesus is on the cross later in Mark 15:29, the passersby are mocking him, saying, aha, you who would destroy the temple or rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself, will come down from the cross. Now, what is the background then? And by the way, this is what we call an unexplained allusion in Mark, which is where you have an unexplained detail with no further elaboration or background, which is in its own right is a mark of verisimilitude, is a mark of historicity. But if we go over to John's account, this is in the wake of the temple cleansing towards the beginning of Jesus' ministry. It says, the Jews said to him, what sign do you show us for doing these things? Jesus answered them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Now, notice that Jesus never said anything about destroying a man-made temple or rebuilding in 3 days, but not by human hands. That's a misrepresentation of what Jesus had said. John supplies the original statement, but does not record the later misrepresentation and the use as an accusation at Jesus' trial. Mark supplies the later misrepresentation of what Jesus had said, but not the original statement, right? So they can't fit together like pieces of a jigsaw in a way that points to the historicity of both. In verse 21, of course, John clarifies he was speaking about the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. Now, as a side point, this is an example of what I call an authorial aside, where the author, and John does this multiple times throughout his gospel, very scrupulously distinguishes between Jesus' words and John's interpretation of Jesus' words, right? Which is in its own right a mark of historical scrupulousness. And John does this multiple times throughout his gospel. Notice also in verse 20 here, the Jews then said, it's taken 46 years to build this temple, and will he raise it up in 3 days? Now, according to Josephus, when does Herod the Great begin construction work in the temple? Well, here's the text here. It says, now Herod, in the 18th year of his reign, and after the acts already mentioned, undertook a very great work, that is, to build for himself the temple of God, and make it larger in compass, and to raise it to a most magnificent altitude, as esteeming it to be the most glorious of all his actions. Right? So this, so Herod the Great began to reign in 36 BC. And so the 18th year of the reign of Herod the Great lands you in approximately 19 BC. 46 years on from which lands you in 28 AD. So that gives you an approximate timestamp for when Jesus cleansed the temple in John's Gospel in chapter 2. Now, according to Luke, when does Jesus begin his public ministry, which would be not long before that early temple cleansing reported by John? Well, it's in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. Now, when does Tiberius Caesar become emperor of Rome? Well, according to the Roman historians Tacitus, Cassius Dio, and Suetonius, Caesar Augustus, this is Tiberius's adoptive father, dies in 14 AD. Right, here's Suetonius, for example. He says that he expired in the same room in which his father Octavius had died when the two sexes, Pompey and Apuleius, were consuls upon the 14th of the council of September, at the 9th hour of the day, being 76 years of age, wanting only 35 days. And Cassius Dio and Tacitus say the same thing. So we can pinpoint this very precisely as happening in 14 AD. Now, the 15th year, then, of the reign of Tiberius Caesar would land you in 28 AD. The very same date we just arrived at independent ground. So there you have a convergence involving Luke and Josephus on one hand, John and Josephus on one hand, and Luke and the Roman historians on the other, that converge on the same approximate date, right? So that's quite remarkable. Another similar example is, so if we go to John 12, this is a detail found only in John, that Jesus arrives in Bethany 6 days before Passover, and he has dinner there with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And another detail found uniquely in John's Gospel is that the triumphal entry happens the following day. So that would be 5 days before Passover. Now, if we go over to Mark, Mark also has an account of the triumphal entry in chapter 11. Now, Mark actually telescopes or condenses the narrative relative to John. He doesn't mention that he actually arrived in Bethany the day before, and it wasn't until the next day that he enters Jerusalem. And he also doesn't give us that same timestamp of the triumphal entry happening 5 days before Passover. But
can you explain that concept to anyone who isn't familiar with it, and telescoping, just so that they, that you might say that and they go, what in the world is that? But can you kind of explain what that is and how common or not it is in terms of the first century, all history taking place during this time?
Yeah. So telescoping is a very common device where it's just condensing the narrative, right, or summarizing it briefly. So if you read Mark alone, you wouldn't get the impression that he had arrived in Bethany the night before, and it wasn't until the next day that he sends the disciples to get the colt, and he enters Jerusalem. But we know that's the case from reading John, right? So John gives a more expanded version than does Mark. Mark summarizes it more succinctly in a more condensed fashion. Now, let's assume, for the sake of argument, that John is correct, that Jesus' triumphal entry happens 5 days before Passover, right? So remember, he enters Bethany 6 days before Passover. He enters Jerusalem the next day, which would be 5 days before Passover. We can actually find each of these days in the Gospel of Mark, even though Mark doesn't give us that same timestamp. So in verse 11, it says, he entered Jerusalem and went into the temple, and when he looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. So this would be the evening 5 days before Passover, if John is correct. Verse 12 says, on the following day, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry. This would be the morning 4 days before Passover, if John is correct. Verse 19, when evening came, they went out of the city. This would be the evening 4 days before Passover. Verse 20, as they passed by in the morning, this would be the morning 3 days before Passover. And then you have various episodes that transpired that day. But ultimately, you get to chapter 13, where you have the Olivet Discourse, where Jesus talks to his disciples concerning the signs of the end of the age and the destruction of the temple, which happens in AD 70. But this conversation, this discourse, happens on the Mount of Olives, which is midway between Jerusalem, where Jesus has been all day, and his accommodation in Bethany. And so we can assume reasonably that he's on his way back to his accommodation in Bethany, and this is the evening, the close of 3 days before Passover. Chapter 14, verse 1. It was now 2 days before the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So it synchronizes in precisely the manner that we might predict on the historical reportage view, but it does so in such an incidental and casual and undesigned way that it supports the historicity of both John and Mark on these very specific details. Again, indicating that these authors are people who are very, very close up to the facts and very well informed. Does that make sense?
That does. That's helpful. Just again, for someone who maybe is not familiar with this whole side of things, could we just take a quick minute to go into some of the other historical devices like telescoping that are actually used in the gospel accounts, just to give people sort of a framework for, like, I love what you brought up a second ago about how did you put it, like the fallacy of objections. Like, if you just only are reading the gospels in order to find what look like contradictions, but are not actually seeing all of these links that fit together, which is what you're showing us now, you can easily kind of not see the forest through the trees, as you put it. But I have found that something like telescoping as a historic technique that is common at the time, that is also used by the gospel writers, helps me to understand how the surface level idea that I had at one point in my life of, oh, look at this, he said this many days, he said that many days, these guys are liars, none of this is true, and now I can move on with my life. I think that in order for people to be able to think about this in a more nuanced way, it's helpful for them to be aware of some of what is in play in terms of how things are not really a contradiction between the accounts, but are actually fitted together, like how you described. So I don't know if there's anything else like telescoping that you would want to.
Yeah, I don't think anyone that is being reasonable would think that there's a discrepancy between John 12 and Mark 11. I mean, there's nothing fact-changing about this. There's nothing that's factually incorrect about the fact that Jesus approached Bethany and then he sent the disciples to fetch the colts and make preparations to enter Jerusalem. John just gives us more detail that he arrives 6 days before Passover, has dinner there with Lazarus, Mary, and Martha, and then the following day he enters Jerusalem. So I've never actually come across someone who would allege that this is a contradiction. This is just a literary device that we might well employ even in our own writing. There's also, of course, like spotlighting. So in cases where one report says that there were, so for example, Luke tells us that there were 2 angels at the tomb, whereas Mark and Matthew report only 1. But that's just spotlighting. Mark and Matthew report spotlight the angel who spoke without necessarily negating that there was another present at the time. And that's just standard. Even today, we might engage in that kind of spotlighting. Or there's also achronological narration. Sometimes you have a series of pericopes that are transitioned with conjunctions like kai or de, which mean like and. There's no clear temporal markers. Now, I'd be very careful to distinguish that from what one might call dyschronological narration, which is where events are being reported with clear temporal markers, but narrated in an order contrary to the way things in fact went down. I think that would be an error, and I don't think that there are any examples where events are narrated with chronological markers, but the author intended it to be understood as happening in a different order or different sequence. Augustine, in fact, very carefully distinguishes between achronological and dyschronological narration. And he, in fact, says that he doesn't use those terms, of course, but the concept is there. And he insists that he says it's self-evident there were 2 temple cleansings because John gives very clear temporal markers situating the temple cleansing towards the beginning of Jesus' ministry. And you've got the reference to 4 to 6 years it's taken us to build this temple, which situates it very clearly in around 28 AD. 27, 28 AD thereabouts. So yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I just wanted to, I know that's not the main drive of what we're doing here, but I just wanted to put into, the listener's mind that basically there's a lot of people on the internet saying, look at this, how many women were at the tomb, or was it an angel that said that? And people will point to the different accounts having slightly different details in order to say, here's a contradiction, and therefore this is not valid information, basically. And I was just trying to at least allude to that. For every one of those, there is some, I don't know how you would put it, but either like
historic device in play or some harmonization where you'll see that there's actually not two mutually exclusive things in play or something along those lines.
Yeah, I do want to very carefully distinguish my approach from the approach of someone like a Michael Licona, who inserts the existence of fact-changing literary devices in the Gospels, which I deny existed at all. I don't think that there was any evidence, or at least any strong evidence, that such literary devices existed. And in fact, there's quite good evidence to the contrary. So I would reject some of the, I don't believe, for example, in geographical displacement. So Licona, for example, will say that that the location of the first appearance to the disciples was moved either from Galilee to Jerusalem or vice versa. I don't believe that that sort of thing existed. Or Licona will say that, and Dan Wallace also maintains this, that in John, when Jesus says, "I thirst" from the cross, that's the dynamic equivalent of my God, why have you forsaken me?" I don't see any reason to conclude that. And I think if it were true, that would actually be damaging to our ability to have confidence in the historicity of the Gospels.
So how would you go about reconciling that difference, just as one example?
Which particular one?
The thirst from the cross versus my God.
There's no even apparent contradiction there, right? So there's no apparent contradiction, because no account is contending that it is giving us an exhaustive list of everything Jesus said from the cross, right? So I think that's an unforced error, where there's not even an appearance of an error, and so it's a contrived solution to a problem that does not in fact exist. As for the resurrection appearances, I think that the first appearance took place in Jerusalem. I think John and Luke are both very clear about that. Matthew and Mark only report appearances an appearance in Galilee. John also reports an appearance in Galilee that came later. I believe that there was both an appearance in Jerusalem and in Galilee. The first appearance being in Jerusalem, or appearances being in Jerusalem, and then they went to Galilee and had an encounter with Jesus there, and then came back to Jerusalem. That's when he gave them the instruction to remain in Jerusalem. So I think that for many of those cases, these are very plausibly harmonizable.
And in terms of who discovers the empty tomb, would you say that that is also something similar?
Yeah. So I'll share my screen here again. Yeah, so if we go over to John 20, for example, it says, "In the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark and saw the stone had been taken away from the tomb." Now, if you read John in isolation, you might well get the impression that that Mary Magdalene alone discovered the tomb empty on Easter morning. Whereas if you look at Luke 24, we read, "It was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary, the mother of James, and other women with them who told these things to the apostles." But it gets even worse. So we can press the objection further, because in Matthew 28, it tells us about Mary Magdalene, the other Mary went to see the tomb, and we know from Luke that there were other women there as well. And they have an encounter with an angel and with Jesus, right? And so how is it then that Mary Magdalene comes back and says she doesn't know what's happened to the body of Jesus, right, in John's Gospel? Well, if we read, so what would we predict, supposing that these accounts are in fact harmonizable? We predict that Mary Magdalene must have left the larger group of women prior to their encounter with the risen Lord. And that's precisely what is suggested by a careful reading of John 20, verse 2, which says, "So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, 'They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know,'" the verb is in the plural, uk, udamen, "where they have laid him." So notice the use of the plural verb there indicates that she's actually representing a larger group of women, which is consistent with what we see in the other Gospels. And so this actually points to the independence of John and the synoptics in regards to the discovery of the empty tomb.
That's super interesting. That is super interesting. I almost want to. I feel like are we on a rabbit trail, or is this all relevant to your main point?
Well, I mean, it's helpful to engage with objections. I mean, obviously, there's a lot more examples of positive evidence that we could adduce or draw from. We haven't even touched the book of Acts either, in which there's just I mean, Acts is the most extensively well corroborated book of the entire Bible, I would contend. If you want, I can give you some more examples from the Gospels, or we can move on to Acts. Or
Yeah, I'd love to hit a couple more from the Gospels if you have those prepped or top of mind, and then we can transition into Acts. That sounds great. And again, I hope I'm not side trailing you too much. I just know I've never actually heard that sort of that concept that you brought up at the start of our recording about how objections and obsession with those contradictions can actually.
Well, yeah, there's an evidential asymmetry because supposing that these are historical errors, right? There is a lot easier to get things wrong than it is to get them right, right?
Yes.
And so the points of historical confirmation on matters of specific detail are more evidentially forceful in confirming reliability than the contradictions are in disconfirming it. Right. There's a lot more ways in which we might be missing a crucial piece of information that would harmonize the sources, or in which a minor good faith mistake might be incorporated to the sources, assuming that the historical reporter's view is correct. Then there are ways, supposing that the accounts are fictitious, that the numerous points of historical confirmation on matters of specific detail might have arisen. So there's an evidential asymmetry there. To take another example.
Actually, Dr. McClatchy, before you dive into the other example, can you just kind of define, because I don't know that we ever did, although you've referenced it a few times, the historical reportage view.
Yeah. So
what is that?
So I believe that the Gospels and Acts are straightforward historical reportage. I believe so. Essentially, what it says on the tin. I think that the authors are people who are very well informed and very close up to the facts, and in the habit of being scrupulous and truthful. And I think that can be demonstrated by numerous points of historical confirmation. I don't think that the Gospel authors ever deliberately made stuff up, right, or changed the facts contrary to what they knew to be the case. So that's essentially the essence of the historical reportage model. To take another example of an undesigned coincidence between, let's go to this one in John 13. So this account is found uniquely in John. We learned that Jesus, this is at the Last Supper, Jesus rose from supper, he laid aside his outer garments, taking a towel, tied it around his waist, he poured water into a basin, and he began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. So Jesus washed the disciples' feet, which is actually the very lowliest of tasks that was normally reserved for a household slave. Now, John leaves unexplained, why does Jesus decide to give the disciples this object lesson in servanthood on this particular occasion? If we go over to Luke's account in Luke chapter 22, Luke does not report the foot washing, but he does tell us something not found in John, that a dispute arose among the disciples as to which of them was to be regarded as the greatest. And he said to them, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and those in authority over them are called benefactors. But not so with you. Rather, let the greatest among you become as the youngest, and the leader as one who serves. For who is the greater, one who reclines at table, or one who serves? Is it not the one who reclines at table? But I am among you as the one who serves. So Luke reports the occasion that apparently gave rise to Jesus' object lesson of servanthood, namely the dispute that arose among the disciples over which of them was the greatest. Whereas John reports the object lesson of servanthood, but not the occasion that gave rise to it. Right? So the accounts fit together in a way that makes sense on the historical reportage view. Does that make sense?
It does. Yes, it does.
Cool. Here's another one. This is a piece of external confirmation of John. In John chapter 7, John 7 and 8 are set during the Feast of Booths, also known as the Feast of Tabernacles. We know that from verse 2. The Jewish Feast of Booths was at hand. Now, you might recall, having read through the Gospels, that Jesus loves to draw from the occasion, from the surroundings, from the environment, right? He does this very routinely. He likes to raise a discourse from the occasion that is there presenting itself. For instance, in Luke 5, after causing the miraculous catch of fish, he says to Simon Peter, "Do not be afraid, from now on you'll be catching men." Or in John 4, the woman of Samaria is coming to the well because she's thirsty, and Jesus takes the time to explain to her about the fountains of living water, where which she will never be thirsty again, and so on.
Yep.
Now, Jesus does this in John 7 and 8, but John doesn't explain the historical background. You have to know the context, which is not given to us by John. So in verse 37, it says, on the last day of the feast, the great day, Jesus stood up and cried out, "If anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water." And then the narrator interprets this. "Now this he said about the Spirit, whom those who believed in him were to receive, for as yet the Spirit had not been given because Jesus was not yet glorified." This is actually another example of one of those authorial asides in John, where John scrupulously distinguishes Jesus' words from John's interpretation of Jesus' words, which again suggests that he was an historically scrupulous author. Now, in chapter 8, verse 12, Jesus goes on and says, again, Jesus spoke to them saying, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, will have the light of life." Now, these are both very provocative claims for Jesus to make of himself. I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. And if anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scripture said, out of his heart flows living water. These are really provocative claims concerning his own identity. Now, what's the historical context here? Well, John doesn't tell us. But let's look up the Babylonian Talmud, which is a compilation of Jewish traditions. It was put together or assembled around 500 AD. Many of the traditions go back much further than that, though. This is in a tract. There's a whole tract in the Talmud that's dedicated to the Feast of Booths. And in chapter 5 of that tract, we read the following. It says, "He who has not witnessed the rejoicings at the water drawing has, throughout the whole of his life, witnessed no real rejoicing. At the expiration of the first holiday of the festival, they descended into the women's court, where a great transformation was made. Golden candelabra were placed there, with 4 golden basins at the top of each, and 4 ladders were put to each candelabrum, on which stood 4 lads from the rising youth of the priesthood, holding jars of oil containing 120 lugs, with which to replenish each basin. The castor of breeches and belts of the priests were torn into shreds for wicks which they lighted. There was not a court in Jerusalem that was not illuminated by the lights of the water drawing. Pious and distinguished men danced before the people, with lighted flambeaux in their hands, and sang hymns and lauds before them, and the Levites accompanied them with harps, psaltery, cymbals, and numberless musical instruments." And so, apparently, at the Feast of Tabernacles, there was this water drawing ceremony. In fact, the previous chapter in this tract indicates the water was taken from the pool of Siloam and it was poured over the altar in the temple. And we just saw that this was associated with a special festival of lights where many candelabra were lit, which then adds historical background to Jesus' statements in John 7 and 8. "If anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water. And I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but have the light of life." But John never explains this historical background, even though elsewhere he sometimes takes time out on various occasions to explain, for the sake of his Gentile readers, some of the Jewish customs and background. He never does so here. So he can't necessarily count on his Gentile readers making the connection to the context of the Feast of Booths. And even many of his Jewish readers might be too young at the time of his writing to remember the festival, because these practices came to an end with the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Under the general Titus, the son of the Emperor Vespasian of the Flavian family. If John was writing, as the early church contended that he was in his old age from Ephesus, and he's writing towards the end of the 1st century, the temple's already gone. There's no longer an altar in the temple upon which to pour the water from Siloam, right? And so John doesn't take the time to explain this historical background. He just wants to move on with the story. And so this it aligns very well with Jesus' modus operandi elsewhere, where he likes to draw from the occasion, raise a discourse from the environment. And so this, again, supports the historicity of these sayings in John. Notice also that it says, "If anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink." Compare this with what Jesus says in the Johannine Thunderbolt, what many scholars call the Johannine Thunderbolt in Matthew 11. So it's called that because it sounds very much like what you might expect to read in John's Gospel. Jesus says, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you'll find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." We see it's the same Jesus who says this in Matthew, who says in John, "If anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink." Right? You can see this, the subtle unity of Jesus' turn of mind behind John and Matthew that supports that this is the same Jesus that lies behind those historical accounts. Notice also, it says, "Whoever believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water." Now, where is this scripture in the Old Testament? There isn't one. This is what we call a phantom scripture. There is no text that says this verbatim in the Old Testament. And quite plausibly, Jesus is giving a summary statement of a set of Old Testament passages, and we can speculate about what some of those were. And Jeremiah 2:13 comes to mind, for example, as do others. But John, if John were inventing this, it seems unlikely that he would have fictitiously attributed a statement to Jesus where Jesus quotes a scripture that no one's ever been able to actually find, right? It's more plausible that Jesus is quoting scripture in some unique way, an obscure way of summarizing a set of Old Testament passages. So when you take these considerations particularly together, you've got a pretty strong case that these words actually represent the historic, authentic Jesus of Nazareth. Does that make sense?
That does. That's quite interesting, all of that. And to your last point there, I can think of a couple other examples where the way that Jesus referenced or quoted something from the Old Testament was a little bit more abstract, I guess you could say, for lack of a better word. It wasn't like a direct quote, or he wasn't using it in the way that you might use it today, or anticipate that someone would use it. So, and I think what I'm thinking of is the passage, and I think is it Isaiah 61, where he's basically talking about hell and the ashes rising up forever and the worm not dying. Do you know?
Isaiah 66.
Oh, sorry, Isaiah 66. Yeah. But the way that he talks about that is at least when I read it and when I kind of connected those dots in my mind, it was unexpected. But I guess what I'm saying is, if that's true, then that almost works alongside with what you're saying here, that he's comfortable with taking a concept out of the Old Testament and applying it in
the New Testament authors do that as well. So that's not something that's unique to Jesus, but
sure.
But in this particular case, Jesus is quoting a text, and he says, "For the scripture has said," as the scripture has said, and he quotes something that's not actually there in the scripture, at least as a direct quote.
He's actually giving quotations. Okay, I didn't realize that. Oh, I have balloons. Hello. Let's celebrate that. Okay. So you're saying what makes this different than the Isaiah 66 reference is that this actually has the quotes placed around it by the author of John.
Well, there aren't quote marks in Greek, of course. This is an English translation, but Jesus is saying, as the scripture has said, and then he gives it looks like a quote from scripture, but there is no actual text that says this, at least verbatim.
I see.
It's probably a summary statement of a set of Old Testament passages, but it seems somewhat unlikely that John, if he were fictitiously ascribing those words to Jesus, would have created a saying where Jesus quotes a scripture that doesn't actually exist.
Yes. Okay. That makes sense. I'm tracking with you.
Yeah. But I think the strongest point of the ones that I gave is the connection to the Talmud and the historical background there, and how it aligns with Jesus' modus operandi across the other Gospels.
That's fascinating. You make me think when you bring up the Talmud too. This is maybe a slightly different point, but do you know in a few different instances in the Babylonian Talmud where it describes Jesus as like a worker of black magic or dark magic or something like that? I mean, that's a different point, but I also think that that's interesting in terms of just establishing that he was a real historic person who was doing certain things that they were not necessarily a fan of, but were powerful in nature.
Yeah, I'm not convinced that they had independent access to the historical facts, though. I think that our most important and credible sources are the New Testament sources themselves. I mean, we see, for example, the testimony of Flavianum and Josephus, and it is not at all implausible that Josephus got that information about Jesus from Christians that he'd conversed with. And we already know what Christians in the first century believed about Jesus because we have the New Testament. Tacitus mentions Jesus, but he was friends with Pliny the Younger, and Pliny the Younger was interrogating Christians, and so it's not at all implausible that he got his information on Jesus secondhand. So I think that our most important sources are those in the New Testament, which we can show, as I've said a few times, are very close up to the facts and well informed.
Yeah. Now, can I ask one question before we pivot to, I think we're going to Acts in a second here, but I did want to ask, because I could imagine someone thinking, as you talked about John writing this in, what would you say, around like 80 or sorry, like 90 AD or something. He's
Yeah,
like
I
roughly.
mean, so estimates for the dates of the Gospels vary. I don't think we can precisely determine when the Gospels were written, unlike with the letters of Paul, where we can give very precise estimates of the year in which it was written. With the Gospels, it's a lot more difficult to do that. I mean, dates for the Gospel of John range from anywhere between like the 50s to the 90s AD. So, I mean, the most common view is that John's Gospel was written towards the end of the first century, perhaps around the 90s AD, because the early church believed that he wrote in his old age from Ephesus. And that I tend to sympathize with that perspective. Jonathan Bernier wrote a book called Rethinking the Dates of the New Testament, in which he contends that John's Gospel is pre-70 AD, and there are a minority of scholars that take that view. But I think that what we have much more grounds for confidence on is the eyewitness nature of the Gospel of John. I think that dates are a secondary consideration, which are weaker more weakly supported than the case for the eyewitness perspective. Does that make sense?
It totally does. And where I was going to go with that is just to establish, and you got there before I did, but just, he's probably an elderly gentleman at the time when he's actually putting these accounts down to paper or papyri or whatever. If someone were to ask why wait decades and decades and decades later to actually codify this or record this, if it's the most important information in the history of the world, how would you respond to that?
We don't have to give an answer to that. I don't know. Perhaps John was. He read these. I think that John probably had read the Synoptic Gospels and thought that he had something additional to contribute, which is why you see very little. There is some, but little overlap with the Synoptic Gospels. You see a lot of information that's not found in the Synoptic Gospels because John was intentionally, I think, trying to supplement the Synoptic Gospels with his own perspective. But it's not particularly important why he waited. That might just be a question that we don't know the answer to, but it doesn't undermine the positive case for John being very highly reliable. And if readers are interested in a really extensive treatment of the reliability of John's Gospel, I highly recommend Lydia McGrew's book, The Eye of the Beholder, The Gospel of John as Historical Reportage. Also, if you go to my website, jonathanmcclatchy.com, and click on Writing, I have an article that I published fairly recently. It's a lengthy article on Word. It was like 80 plus pages on the Gospel of John, defending its historicity and concluding that it was written by John, the son of Zebedee.
Oh, that's super cool. Yeah, I'll make sure that I put that in the description of this video so people can get to that easily. And I just wanted to ask, would that also apply to Mark, what you said? Like, we don't necessarily need to know why he didn't record what he did earlier. We just need to be able to make a case that what he did record is factual in nature.
Yeah, exactly. I think that we can make a strong case that Mark is the most probable author, in particular, in view of the fact that the early church unanimously attributed the Gospel of Mark to John Mark, despite the fact that he's such an obscure figure. The only thing we know about him is that he caused a massive split between Paul and Barnabas by withdrawing from a mission in Pamphylia in Acts 13, verse 13. And later in Acts 15, there's a split between Paul and Barnabas over John Mark. And that's about all we know about him. And so he doesn't have the best press in the New Testament. And yet the early church are quite unanimous in attributing it to John Mark, even though Justin Martyr alludes to the Gospel of Mark, and he calls it the Memoirs of Peter. Now, he was writing around 150 AD, thereabouts. And so why is it then that the later authors like Irenaeus, Clement, Tertullian, they attribute it not to Peter? They say, well, it was actually just Mark, but he got his information from Peter, unless they had good reason to think that was the case, right? So that, I think, supports traditional authorship of the Gospel of Mark.
So do you think that those two guys were working together on it? Do you think
I think quite plausibly, yeah.
That's what I think too. I mean, to me, that just makes sense because as far as we know, John Mark wasn't there for everything that he relays, whereas Peter would have been, right?
Right. And in the case of Luke, who also wasn't an eyewitness, he was a traveling companion of Paul, and we're about to make a case that he was in fact a traveling companion of Paul and therefore had access to not only the testimony of Paul, but also the testimony of the other apostles, because he's present with Paul in Acts 21 when Paul meets with the Jerusalem leaders, and Luke says that he went into James, and all the elders are present, whom we know from Galatians 2 included at minimum Cephas, that's Simon Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, and John, the son of Zebedee, two of Jesus' most intimate disciples and Jesus' own brother. And moreover, Luke is present with Paul in Acts 24, when Paul is imprisoned for at least 2 years in Caesarea Maritima, which is in relative geographical proximity to Jerusalem. It's only a couple of days' walk. And so not only does Luke claim in his prologue when he's addressing Theophilus in Luke chapter 1, that he's received information from individuals who were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word, but we can also show that he had access to individuals who are eyewitnesses of Jesus' ministry, and in particular purported witnesses to the resurrection. And moreover, we can show from the numerous points of historical confirmation of the Gospel of Luke, and there's a lot more than what we just discussed, that not only does he have access to those living witnesses, but he's extracting reliable information from them. And so that provides part of the foundation for thinking that the accounts in Luke, Acts concerning the resurrection, actually do represent the testimony of the alleged witnesses.
Yeah, I think that's really well stated. Before we dive into Acts, one last question. Sorry, you're the things that you're saying are raising thoughts for me. So I'm just curious. If the answer is just a flat no, then no problem. We can just move on. But have you ever heard of any scholar attempting to answer? How do I phrase this? Like, is there potentially some logistical challenge to getting a Gospel of Mark earlier in light of the persecution, in light of how difficult it is to actually make historical documents at that time? Have you ever heard anybody talk about this from that perspective? Was it expensive? Was it, or do we just kind of accept like, hey, the amount of time from what we think the first, autograph would have been as it relates to the actual events is actually normal for history. So everybody chill out about the timing of all of this. Is it something more like that? Or is it like, hey, this is a little bit later than we would expect? If you're like, whoa, we just experienced.
You're talking about the manuscripts or the original autograph from the events?
I'm talking about the autograph,
Okay.
which we don't. I know that we don't have the actual text, but I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of a person who is either an eyewitness themselves or is talking to an eyewitness. And the initial project is we should get this written down in order to before our memories start to lapse or whatever. Like, let's get this in writing ASAP. And you would, at least as far as I'm imagining it, you would want to get everything written down as fast as possible. And I'm just curious
again, it's very difficult to date the Gospels, frankly.
Right.
I think that the Synoptic Gospels are probably pre-70. That's not a conclusive argument, but I think it's considerably more likely than not that they're pre-70. I think that Acts was probably written around 62 AD because Luke has been building up suspense to Paul's appearance before Caesar, because Paul appeals to Caesar. I think it's in verse 20 in Acts chapter 25, and so he's been building up suspense. He spends 8 chapters on Paul's legal troubles, and that's something that Luke emphasizes. And again, he's been building up the suspense, which is never resolved because it ends on a cliffhanger with Paul being placed under house arrest. That's not a conclusive argument, but it is, I think, significant. There's also some other clues in Acts that suggests an early date of composition. For example, the use of martus in the sense of witness rather than the more modern sense of martyr, or the sparing use of Christian, and so forth. There's other points there as well. And moreover, there's an independent reason to think that Luke is relatively early, because in 1 Timothy 5:18, Paul quotes from Luke 10:7. He says, "For the scripture says," quoting Deuteronomy 25, verse 4, "Do not muzzle the ox while straining at the grain, and the worker deserves his wages," which comes from Luke 10, verse 7. Now, of course, that relates to the controverted question of who wrote the pastoral letters. I've written a very detailed essay on my website where I go into the evidence for the Pauline authorship of the pastoral letters and engage in detail with the objections. And I've concluded that the evidence for Pauline authorship is really quite compelling for the pastoral letters. And so that would mean that Luke has to predate Paul writing First Timothy by long enough to be considered scripture at the time of his writing. And so that also points to an early date for Luke, but we can't really pinpoint exactly when the Gospels were written. But these are quite early relative to other ancient records, how far removed they are from the events in question.
Okay, that kind of does. I mean, just to put it in a really plain manner, if I were to experience something today like the risen Jesus in front of me, I would probably write down every detail of it on my computer that night, because I have the privilege of having a computer with which I can do so. My question is more so, and if this is probably way outside of your area. I'm just so curious about. Let's say that Peter has the same ambition. Oh my word! I have to record this ASAP. My question is, what are the logistics or like the limitations in his ability to do so, given how things were at that time?
Yeah, I mean, it was of course expensive, particularly if you were to hire a scribe, and you've also got to acquire papyri on which to write this stuff, and and also it was a largely illiterate culture, and so not everyone was able to read and write. So yeah, I mean, it's not at all. And also Luke tells us in his prologue that many had undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us. I mean, we don't know, because a lot of this probably has been lost to us. There are probably other sources that he's got in mind here that we no longer have. We know that Luke was dependent on Mark, at least. Some scholars think he was also dependent on Matthew, although that's a minority view. But much of this has been lost. So yeah, it's a question that we don't necessarily have to be able to answer in order to have confidence that what we have in the sources are highly reliable and trustworthy on the basis of these numerous points of historical confirmation.
Okay, yeah, no, that all. I'm not saying this as an objection to anything that you're laying out. It's just an additional thing that comes up in my mind that maybe has come up in other people's mind, and I think that, again, a lot, like one thing I've noticed when skeptics or seekers or even me will read the Bible is we'll kind of project the way that the world is today onto the way that the world was at the time and say, I would have live streamed that immediately on my phone. And it's like, we should be aware that the logistics and costs and access was quite different at the time. So I guess I was kind of just trying to bring that out. Okay, so do you want to go to Acts?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure. So there's numerous lines of evidence, again, for the historicity of Acts, confirming that he is, in fact, as he claims to be, a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul, and someone who is very well informed about Paul's itinerary and travels. One class of evidence, the one that I find to be the most compelling, is what we call undesigned coincidences. We've seen some of those between the Gospels. There's also examples between Acts and Paul's letters. So, for instance, in Acts chapter 15, we read the following. Now, so this is when Paul and Barnabas are embarking on their second missionary journey. And it says that Barnabas wanted to take with him John called Mark, but Paul thought best not to take with them one who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. And there arose a sharp disagreement, so they separated from each other. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and departed, having been commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. All right, so according to Acts, there's this sharp falling out between Barnabas and Paul over John Mark, who's previously withdrawn from them in Pamphylia and not gone with them to the work. In fact, Luke writes about this episode in Acts 13, where he says, Paul and his companions set sail from Paphos and came to Perga and Pamphylia, and John left and returned to Jerusalem. Now, this text in Acts 15 suggests that there's some sort of prior relationship, prior connection, or backstory involving John Mark and Barnabas, of which Acts does not take note. Because Barnabas is really keen for John Mark to go, to the point he even splits ways with Paul. Now, if we go over to Colossians chapter 4, we read the following. This is one of Paul's prison letters that he wrote from Rome around 60 to 62 AD. It says, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you, and Mark, the cousin of Barnabas. They're cousins. They have a familial relationship, which then explains what's going on in Acts But it looks like by the time Paul wrote Colossians, this rift between Paul and Barnabas over John Mark's been resolved. There's no mention of it there. In fact, it looks like they're on good terms by now. But it doesn't look like the author of Acts is inventing this story to go with Colossians, because there's no mention there of the familial relationship. So the accounts fit together in a way that makes sense on the historical reportage view. So does that make sense?
That does. Yeah, that definitely does.
So this supports both the historicity of Acts as well as the Pauline authorship of Colossians, which is one of the disputed letters. This is part of a larger case for the Pauline authorship of the book of Colossians. Let's go to another one. So in chapter 16, Paul and Silas, because Silas joined him instead of Barnabas, are in Philippi. And they cast out a spirit of divination from a slave girl. And this leads to them getting dragged before the city authorities for disturbing the peace, and they're thrown in prison. And they're singing hymns and praying to God, and the prisoners are listening. And that night there's an earthquake at midnight, and they find their shackles loosed. And the jailer rushes in about to kill himself because there's a very steep penalty in Roman law for letting prisoners escape under your watch. Their penalty is essentially yours. And so if there was anyone that was to be given the death penalty, well, now that's your penalty. And so he's about to kill himself because he'd rather take his own life by his own hand than end up getting crucified or something horrendous like that. But then Paul announces that all are present. And so he actually becomes a believer, and his family get baptized. And we pick up the story here in verse 35. It says, when it was day, the magistrate sent the police, saying, let those men go. And the jailer reported these words to Paul, saying, the magistrates have said to let you go. Therefore come down and go in peace. But Paul said to them, they've beaten us publicly, uncondemned, men who are Roman citizens, and have thrown us into prison. And do they now throw us out secretly? No, let them come themselves and take us out. The police reported these words to the magistrates, and they were afraid when they heard that they were Roman citizens. So they came and apologized to them, and they took them out and asked them to leave the city. So, according to Acts, the reason, so according to Acts, Paul was indignant about the fact that he's been flogged despite being a Roman citizen, which was against Roman law, right? Mm-hmm. And in fact, I should say crucifixion technically wasn't allowed to be done to a Roman citizen, so that necessarily wouldn't apply to the guard here, but be that as it may. So it was against Roman law to flog a Roman citizen, and he's been uncondemned. He's been thrown into the prison, so he's really indignant. He's quite upset about the way he's been treated here. Paul actually writes about this in his own words in 1 Thessalonians 2. It says, though we had already suffered and been shamefully treated at Philippi, as you know, we had boldness undergone to declare to the gospel of God in the midst of much conflict, right? And so so according to so Paul says shamefully treated at Philippi, as you know, which implies that the Thessalonians know about Paul's shameful treatment in Philippi, and we wonder, how does he know that? Right? How do they know this? It says, as you know. How do the Thessalonians know about Paul's shameful treatment in Philippi? Well, according to Acts, where is Paul's very next port of call? It's in chapter 17. When they passed through Pamphylia and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. Right? So his very next port of call then is Thessalonica. And so you can imagine Paul, still full of indignation about the way he's been treated in Philippi, coming to Thessalonica and recounting to the new converts there what just happened in Philippi. Now, 1 Thessalonians, arguably, depending on when you date Galatians, is Paul's earliest letter. But it doesn't look like Acts is using 1 Thessalonians as a source, and there's a number of reasons to think that. For example, in chapter 1, Paul emphasizes how he turned to God from idols to serve the living true God, whereas Acts emphasizes the conversion of pagans and God-fearing Gentiles. Right? So these are independent sources. Moreover, look at chapter 17. So Paul and Silas are in Thessalonica, and there's this mob of Jews that stir up trouble for them there in Thessalonica. And so so Paul has to leave in haste to go to Berea, which is about 45 miles away from Thessalonica. And unfortunately for him, so it's about 45 miles away in Macedonia from Thessalonica. So unfortunately for him, this mob of Jews follow him from Thessalonica to Berea. Since when the Jews from Thessalonica learned the word of God was proclaimed at Paul at Berea also, they came there too, agitating and stirring up the crowds. Then the brothers immediately sent Paul off on his way to the sea, but silenced him to remain there. Those who conducted Paul brought him as far as Athens, and after a student came out of silenced him to come to him as soon as possible, they departed. So notice this is an example of what we call an unexplained allusion, which I mentioned briefly earlier, where he leaves behind Silas and Timothy, and there's no further explanation as to why he leaves them behind, right? If you're making stuff up, this is a really strange thing to include without any further explanation as to why he's leaving them behind. But they're given explicit instructions to catch up with him as soon as possible. And so we presume that they catch up with him in Athens. But the next we see of them is actually when Paul's no longer in Athens. He's in Corinth in chapter 18, in verse 5, when Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia. And we wonder, what have they been doing this whole time? What's been taking them so long? There's this unexplained gap in the book of Acts. Now, if we look up a map here, so here, just to get a sense of the geographical bearings. So Thessalonica and Berea are cities about 45 miles apart, as I said, in Macedonia. Paul leaves Berea in haste to go to Athens, which is away down here on the peninsula of Greece. And he leaves behind Silas and Timothy with instructions to catch up with him as soon as possible. But the next we see of them is when Paul's over here in Corinth, in Achaia. So what have they been doing? Well, we're not told. But let's go over to 1 Thessalonians 3. Paul says, "Therefore, when we could bear it no longer, we were willing to be left behind at Athens alone, and we sent Timothy, our brother, and God's co-worker in the gospel of Christ, to establish and exhort you in your faith, that no one be moved with these afflictions. For you yourselves know that we are destined for this. For when we were with you, we kept telling beforehand that we were to suffer affliction, just as it's come to pass, and just as you know. For this reason, when I could bear it no longer, I sent to learn about your faith, and fear that some of the tempter attempted you, and our labor would be in vain." So, under the circumstances, Paul was concerned for the well-being of the Christians in Thessalonica. And so he commissioned Timothy to go back from Athens to Macedonia. Hence, we were willing to be left behind to Athens alone to check up on the Christians there to see that they're doing okay. Acts just omits the sending of Timothy back from Athens, hence leaving the cause of Paul's separation from Timothy unexplained. And so this detail in 1 Thessalonians helps to account for this, or explain this otherwise unaccounted for gap in the book of Acts. Notice also that when Paul's in Corinth, he gets acquainted with Aquila and Priscilla, who are tent makers by trade. And it says that they've been expelled from Rome at the instigation of the Emperor Claudius, which scholars generally date to around 49 AD, but that's on the basis of this detail in Acts. This is actually the only first century source that mentions this edict by Claudius, although it's mentioned in a Roman second century source, namely Suetonius. He tells us that Claudius banished from Rome all the Jews who were continually making disturbances at the instigation of one Chrestus. All right, so in the case of Aquila and Priscilla, they end up in Corinth. And so it says he went to see them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade, and he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and tried to persuade Jews and Greeks. Right, and so Paul's ministry model is that during the week, he's working with his hands as a tent maker, and then on the Sabbath day, he goes into the synagogue and reasons with the Jews and Greeks. But then something happens in verse 5 that prompts him to change his ministry model. It says, when Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that the Christ was Jesus. Now, the ESV doesn't do the best job with this particular verse at rendering the nuances of the Greek. In fact, the NIV does a better job here. The way it translates verse 5 is like this. It says, when Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. In fact, if you look up the New English Translation notes, where they explain some of their translational decisions, they note that, so they quote this Greek English lexicon of the New Testament, other early Christian literature, 3rd edition, Seneco 6 states, Senecato to logo, Paul was wholly absorbed in preaching, Acts 18:5, in contrast to the activity cited in verse 3. The imperfect Senecato has been translated as an ingressive imperfect, became wholly absorbed, stressing the change in Paul's activity once Silas and Timothy arrived. At this point, Paul apparently began to work less and preach more. And so what prompts him to change his ministry model in response to the arrival of Silas and Timothy from Macedonia? Well, apparently it's something to do with their arrival. Well, if we go over to 2 Corinthians 11, it says, "Did I commit a sin in humbling myself so that he might be exalted because I preached God's gospel to you free of charge? I robbed other churches by accepting support from them in order to serve you. And when I was with you and was in need, I did not burden anyone, for the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied my need. So I refrained and will refrain from burdening you in any way." And so apparently they brought with them financial aid for Paul, which apparently enabled him to change his ministry model in response to the rival sales activity from Macedonia. In fact, there's further support for this in Philippians 4. Philippi was also a city in Macedonia. And Paul says, "Yet it was kind of you to share my trouble. And you Philippians yourselves know that in the beginning of the gospel, when I left Macedonia, no church entered into partnership with me in giving and receiving except you only. Even in Thessalonica, certainly helped for me as once and again." Right? And so apparently they were involved in providing financially for Paul when he left Macedonia. And so this helps to explain this detail in Acts, which is otherwise left unexplained. Here's another one. So in 1 Corinthians 4, Paul says, "That's why I sent you Timothy." So notice the aorist or past tense here. That's why I sent you Timothy. At the time of his writing, and he's writing from Ephesus to this Greek city of Corinth, the capital of Achaia, he's already sent Timothy on his way. And whereas if you look at chapter 16, verse 10 of the same letter, it says, "When Timothy comes." In Greek, he uses a subjunctive mood. So literally, if Timothy comes, see that Peter is among you, for he's doing the work of the Lord as I am. So even though he's already sent Timothy at the time of his writing, he nonetheless apparently expects his letter to get there first. And so what are we to infer from this? So Timothy must have taken a route to Corinth that's less direct than that taken by the letter. And if we look at a map here, this is Ephesus in Asia Minor, where he's writing from. This is the destination, Corinth. And the most direct way is to send a letter by boat over the Aegean Sea from Ephesus to Corinth. And would infer that Timothy must have taken the indirect overland route going up through Troas and Macedonia en route to Corinth. Meanwhile, Paul presumably remains behind in Ephesus to write 1 Corinthians. That would explain those very subtle details. That's why I sent you Timothy, past tense. If Timothy comes, see that Peter is among you, future tense. So he's already sent Timothy, but nonetheless expects the letter to get there first. That makes sense of that data if that scenario is correct. Now, if we go over to Acts 19, this is precisely what we find. It says, "After these events, Paul resolved in the Spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia and go to Jerusalem, saying, 'After I have been there, I must also see Rome.' And having sent it to Macedonia, two of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while." So he does, in fact, remain behind in Ephesus to write 1 Corinthians, and he sends Timothy, along with Erastus, up through Macedonia, precisely as he predicted, given those clues in 1 Corinthians. But notice how indirect that connection is. It doesn't even mention Corinth as Timothy's destination, right? It's very indirect and circuitous. In fact, it's only in chapter 20 that we read, following the riot in Ephesus, Paul sent for the disciples, and after encouraging them, they said farewell and departed from Macedonia. That's actually when he wrote 2 Corinthians, as it happens. When he had gone through those regions, he gave them much encouragement. He came to Greece, there he spent 3 months, and that's actually when he writes Romans. And when the plot was made against him by the Jews, as he was about to set sail for Syria, he decided to return through Macedonia. Sobered of the Bereans and the prison accompanied him, and of the Thessalonians, Aristarchus and Secundus and Gaius of Derbe, and Timothy. So Timothy apparently did in fact make it to Corinth, precisely as he predicted, given those clues in 1 Corinthians. But again, notice how indirect that connection is. Final point here. Note, who's Timothy's traveling companion up through Macedonia? Is this guy called Erastus? Well, who's Erastus? Well, I mentioned that Romans was written during that 3-month stint in Corinth, right, in Acts 20, verse 3. Well, Romans 16:23 informs us that Erastus is the city treasurer of Corinth. We even have an archaeological discovery, a pavement slab that was recovered from the ruins of ancient Corinth that bears the inscription in Latin that Erastus, in return for his aedileship, bore the expense of this pavement. So how fitting then that Timothy, on his way up through Macedonia with the intent of going to Corinth, is traveling with someone whom we independently know is from Corinth. And so it all fits together in precisely the way you expect on the historical reporter's view. Do you want a couple more, or?
Sure. Yeah, no, I think this is super interesting. And I guess, what's kind of funny is I in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, I want to make sure it's clear, like what exactly you're arguing for. And I think one of the common ways that people think about this, and tell me if you've gotten this through your ministry, is like these sources that are in the Bible are all basically the same source. It's like religious
propaganda. They're somehow all communicating with each other. They're somehow all harmonizing together. They're all on the same team. It's like a controlled message because it's in the Bible, and therefore, of course, there's like agreement. And I think I think what you're kind of showing is like, first of all, these people did not all know each other, right? Like they weren't all like living in the same house and coming up with some like conspiracy of like, you're going to write this and I'm going to write that, and these things are going to match up. These are like different people in history recording events. And what you're saying is they're trying their best job to get that recording to be accurate. And then there's all kinds of unexpected ways that the information interlocks with each other and makes sense. Am I getting that right?
That's exactly right. And the undesigned coincidences between Acts and Paul's letters, I would contend, are even stronger than those in the Gospels, because with the Gospels, there's some level of literary dependence, right, where the Gospel authors know of each other's work. Particularly Matthew and Luke seem to be using Mark, and John probably, I think, had read the Synoptics. But nonetheless, the casualness and incidentalness and undesigned nature of the connections between these sources evince their historical credibility. It demonstrates that they have independent access to the actual historical facts. In the case of the Pauline letters, it's even stronger because you have a very strong case, and I haven't really developed this fully today, but you have a very strong case that the author of Acts has not read Paul's letters. And that's made particularly clear from various surface level discrepancies between Acts and Paul's letters. We looked at the example, for instance, in 1 Thessalonians with you turn to God from idols to serve the living true God, whereas Acts emphasizes the conversion of Jews and God-fearing Gentiles. These are not mutually exclusive, but it does point to their independence. And there are other examples of this throughout the Pauline letters. These are mutually exclusive discrepancies that can be very plausibly harmonized, but nonetheless point to the independence of these sources.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And so it becomes, in light of all of these unexpected connection points, it becomes harder to say that either A, it's a controlled message, like that's very clearly not the case, or oh, hello, yes, or B, people are just basically making stuff up. Like the case becomes stronger and stronger that the events being recorded really did happen.
Right.
That's ultimately the point, right?
Exactly. You see now what I meant by a torrent of evidence that establishes this contention of eyewitness testimony. I can give you 2 or 3 more examples.
Sure. Yeah, let's hit it.
Okay. Sure. Let me share my screen. And by the way, this is just the peak of the iceberg. Literally, if you give me Romans, the Corinthian letters, and Galatians, I can already give you more than 40 examples of this sort of thing. And that's not even counting the external points of confirmation of Acts, of which there are over 100. Right, so this is just literally getting revved up here. Right, so here's another example. So Romans 16, 21 and following says, Timothy, my fellow worker, greets you. So do Lucius and Jason and Sosipater, my kinsmen. I, Tertius, who wrote this letter, greet you in the Lord. Gaius, who is host to me and to the whole church, greets you. Erastus, city treasurer, and our brother Quartus greet you. Okay, so Paul provides a list of his companions at Corinth, right? And strikingly, Sopater and Timothy are 2 names also listed among Paul's traveling companions in Acts chapter 20 and verse 4. I'll pull up here. Where it says, Sopater the Berean son of Persis accompanied him, and the Thessalonians, Aristarchus, Secundus, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timothy, and the Asians, Tychicus, and Trophimus. Okay, so Gaius of Derbe is probably a different individual from the Gaius mentioned in Romans, because the latter individual is said to be Paul's host, which implies that he lived in Corinth or nearby Achaia. And this is likely the same Gaius as the one that baptized Paul, but was baptized by Paul in 1 Corinthians 4. So in 1 Corinthians 1:14. Where it says, I thank God that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius, so that no one may say that you are baptized in my name, right? Which suggests a Corinthian connection. Gaius is, in fact, one of the most common Roman first names in antiquity. And this also supports the independence of Acts and Romans, because if the author of Acts were using the epistle to the Romans as a source for the composition of his own narrative, it's peculiar that he listed an individual by the same name as the figure mentioned in Romans, even though these are separate individuals. right? A copyist would be more likely to link an individual bearing the name of Gaius to Corinth rather than Derbe. Note that the name Zopater is which was a much less frequent name, is a shortened or contracted form of Zos Ipiter, right, which functioned much like a nickname. And this slight difference, back to next 20, this slight difference in spelling between Acts and Romans again indicates that Luke is probably not using Romans as a source for the composition of his narrative, nor vice versa. And also further supporting this is that the names only partially overlap between Acts and Romans. And moreover, of the remaining 5 names given in Acts, 3 are mentioned in Paul's prison epistles, which were composed in Rome, namely Trophimus, who's mentioned in 2 Timothy 4:20, Aristarchus is mentioned in Colossians 4:10, and Philemon is also mentioned. Aristarchus is mentioned in also in Philemon, and Tychicus is mentioned in Ephesians, Colossians, and 2 Timothy. And so these individuals apparently ended up traveling with Paul as far as Rome, which you might expect from reading this account in Acts. Also, if you go over to 1 Corinthians 1, it's another example. 1 Corinthians 1, Paul says, I thank God that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius, so that no one may say that you were baptized in my name. Right, and then he says, I did baptize also the household of Stephanas. Beyond that, I do not know whether I baptized anyone else. Now, William Paley, in his book Hora Paulinae, which I highly commend to your reading, it's called Hora Paulinae, or The Truth of the Scripture History of St. Paul Evince, where he goes through many of these examples of undesigned coincidences. He notes that it may be expected that those whom the apostle baptized with his own hands were converts, distinguished from the rest by some circumstance either of eminence or of connection with him. Yeah, back in 1791, they had the weird way of spelling connection with an X. Romans 16:23 indicates that Gaius provided hospitality for Paul in the church, and so had a particularly close connection with Paul. And moreover, according to 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 15, says the household of Stephanas were the first converts in Achaia. Thus, Paul's letters confirm a special relationship with the 2 individuals, Gaius and Stephanas. But what about Crispus? Well, in Acts 18, verse 8, it indicates that while in Corinth, Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed in the Lord together with his entire household, and many of the Corinthians, hearing Paul, believed and were baptized. And so we learn that Crispus was indeed someone of eminence, being the ruler of the synagogue, and this illuminates why his household was one of the only 3 households whom Paul baptized by his own hands. And so that's another example of an undesigned coincidence between Acts and Paul's letters. Here's just one more. So this one concerns the collection that Paul was receiving for the relief of the saints in Jerusalem. If we go over to 1 Corinthians 16, again, verse 1 through 4, Paul says, Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so you also are to do. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside to store it up as he may prosper, so there'll be no collecting when I come. And when I arrive, I will send those whom you accredit by letter to carry your gift to Jerusalem. If it seems advisable that I should go also, they will accompany me. And then in verse 5 and following, Paul expresses his intention to go to Macedonia and to come into Achaia, or to Corinth from there. And Paul's also thinking about the collection in chapter 16, where he gives specific instructions to the church at Corinth about getting the collection ready, so there'll be no hasty gathering up when he arrives. Now, in 2 Corinthians, Paul says, We want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. For in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. For they give according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means of their own accord, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. Right? So the letter of 2 Corinthians thus appears to have been written at a time when Paul was in Macedonia. He collected money there, and he was planning to come to Corinth from there, hoping the Corinthians would have their portion of the collection ready for his coming. Now, in chapter 9 of 2 Corinthians, Paul says, Now it's superfluous for me to write to you about the ministry for the saints, for I know your readiness, of which I boast about you, to the people of Macedonia, and saying that Achaia has been ready since last year, and your zeal has stirred up most of them. But I am sending the brothers so that our boasting about you may not prove empty. in this matter, so that you may be ready, as I said you would be. Otherwise, if some Macedonians come with me and find that you were not ready, would be humiliated, to say nothing of you, for being so confident. So I thought it necessary to urge the brothers to go on ahead of you and arrange in advance for the gift you have promised, so that it may be ready as a willing gift, not as an exaction. So Paul had bragged to the Corinthians about the Macedonians, and then he tells them that he's been bragging to the Macedonians about them, that he plans to bring some Macedonians with him when he comes to Corinth, and that he wouldn't want the Corinthians to be embarrassed by not being ready with their offering. Right. So in 2 Corinthians 2, verse 12, it says, "When I came to Troas to preach the gospel of Christ, even though a door was opened for me in the Lord, my spirit was not at rest because I did not find my brother Titus there. So I took leave of them and went on to Macedonia." So that we learned that Paul had traveled to Macedonia from Asia Minor, just as one would expect, given that he started from Ephesus. As we saw on the map earlier, Troas is directly along the overland route from Ephesus to Macedonia. Now, in Romans 15, Paul says, "At present, however, I'm going to Jerusalem, bringing aid to the saints. For Macedonia and Achaia being pleased to make some contribution for the poor among the saints at Jerusalem, for they were pleased to do it, and indeed they owe it to them. For if the Gentiles have come to share in their spiritual blessings, they ought also to be of service to them in material blessings." Right. So the letter to the Romans thus was written at a time when Paul had recently finished gathering a collection from Macedonia and Achaia, and he was planning to go to Jerusalem to deliver the funds. Now, at the time of the writing of 1 Corinthians, as we saw previously, Paul does not yet know whether the churches will want him to be responsible for escorting the money to Jerusalem, but that point's already been settled by the time he writes Romans. And Acts actually agrees with this entirely with this entire order of travel, without mentioning fundraising as the purpose of the journey. So we saw previously that in Acts 19, Paul writes 1 Corinthians, or in Acts 19, verse 22, right, when he remains behind in Ephesus and sends Timothy along with Erastus up through Macedonia with the intent of going to Corinth. And then in chapter 20, it says, "After the uproar ceased, Paul sent for the disciples, and after encouraging them, he said farewell and departed from Macedonia." And that's when he writes 2 Corinthians, right? When he's received the collection from Macedonia, and he's on his way to Corinth to collect their portion of the collection from them. It says, when they had gone through these regions, given them much encouragement, he came to Greece. There he spent 3 months, and that's when he writes Romans, when he's gathered the collection, gathered the collection from the church in Corinth. So he spends 3 months there in Corinth. And when a plot was made against him by the Jews, as he was about to set sail for Syria, he decided to return through Macedonia. In fact, in Acts 19:21, Paul sketched out this intended itinerary for himself, where it says, after these events, Paul resolved the spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia and go to Jerusalem, saying, "After I've been there, I must also see Rome." And so, so not only Paul's intentions, but also his actions coincide with the letters and Paul and Acts. But Acts doesn't mention fundraising as the purpose of the journey, right? That's only explicitly mentioned in the letter of in the letters of Paul, in the Romans and the Corinthian letters. Now, Paul gets taken into custody by the Roman soldiers he does end up going to Jerusalem, but he gets taken into custody in Acts 21, verse 27, and that leads to his imprisonment. So from this section onwards, he gets taken into prison. And in Acts 24:17, when he's before Felix, Paul makes this highly indirect allusion to the collection that he's been gathering for the relief of the saints in Jerusalem. He says, "Now, after several years, I came to bring alms to my nation and to present offerings." And so William Paley, in his book Hora Paulini, notes, "Hence, therefore, at length, but fetched from 3 different writings, we have obtained the several circumstances we inquired after, and which the Epistle to the Romans brings together, viz., a contribution in Achaia for the Christians of Jerusalem, a contribution in Macedonia for the same, and an approaching journey of St. Paul to Jerusalem. We have these circumstances, each by some hint in the passage in which it is mentioned, or by the date of the writing in which the passage occurs, fixed to a particular time, and we have that time turning out upon examination to be in all the same, namely, towards the close of St. Paul's second visit to the peninsula of Greece. This is an instance of conformity beyond the possibility, I will venture to say, of random writing to produce. I also assert that it is in the highest degree improbable that it should have been the effect of contrivance and design." Final point here is back over to Acts 20, and we'll look at verse 4. So Luke mentions Sopater the Berean, son of Persis, accompanied him, and of the Thessalonians, Aristarchus and Secundus and Gaius of Derbe, and Timothy, and the Asians, Tychicus and Trophimus. And so this is actually the longest list in the book of Acts of companions of Paul all going somewhere at the same time with him. Mm-hmm. And moreover, the locations that they're from are very carefully noted as well as their names, with Timothy being related to Lystra and Derbe, even though there's no reason why that connection should be repeated here. We already learned that in chapter 16. And it's quite plausible that the people here might be intended as representatives of the different churches contributing to the collection that Paul was making at this time, right? As we see from Paul's letters, Paul's rather touchy about money. Right, he wants everyone to know that he was blameless about money. He's not trying to get money out of people. And this is a big theme in the Corinthian letters. In 1 Corinthians 16, we even see in verses 3 and 4, it says, when I arrive, I will send those whom you credit by letter to carry your gift to Jerusalem. If it seems advisable that I should go also, they will accompany me. So Paul suggests that perhaps someone else might accompany the Corinthians' contribution to Jerusalem, not himself. He will go only if it seems appropriate. And then it turns out by the time he writes Romans that had been resolved. So it's plausible that this extra large group accompanying Paul from Greece to Jerusalem was there in part to make it clear that he'd not absconded with any of the money, as well as to provide more safety in travel with the collection. And these various representatives could attest to the amount that was there at the start, could attest that Paul didn't take any for his own purposes. And Acts, as we just discussed, never mentions the collection at all, except in Paul's mention, his very cryptic allusion to bringing alms in his speech to Felix in chapter 24. So this also, I think, supports the historicity of Acts in a very circuitous and undesigned and casual way, which again evinces that the author was in fact, as he purports to be, a traveling companion of Paul, someone extremely well informed about Paul's itinerary and travels.
Wow, that's a lot. that's super interesting. I like the pin that you put on the end of that, just to remind the listener of what those data points are adding up to in terms of a conclusion. I think that's really helpful. I think that now let me ask you this: in your conversations that you're having with that relate to doubt, how like, in other words, is this all a part of the case for the resurrection, or is this just an argument for that the book of Acts is recording history?
Yeah, it's actually an argument for both the resurrection as well as the conversion and miracles of Paul. So let me show how it ties into both of those arguments quickly. So it feeds into the resurrection, as I summarized earlier, because the Gospel of Luke in the prologue purports to have received information from eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. Mm-hmm. And if Luke is present with Paul in Acts chapter 21, he has access to living witnesses of Jesus' ministry, and in particular purported witnesses to the resurrection. So here's the text from Acts 21, where it says, when we had come to Jerusalem, so this is among the we passages, the brothers received us gladly. On the following day, Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders are present, right? And we know from Galatians 2 that the elders included James, that's the brother of Jesus, Cephas, that is Simon Peter, and John the son of Zebedee, right? And so at minimum, Luke has access to those witnesses of the resurrection. And moreover, in Acts 24, Luke is also present with Paul when Paul is in Caesarea Maritima, where he's there for at least 2 years. Now, Caesarea Maritima is in relative geographical proximity to Jerusalem. It's only about a 2 to 3 days walk. So let me find a map here. So this is Jerusalem down here, and this is Caesarea Maritima. It's about 2 to 3 days walk. So during that 2-year period, Luke would have had ample opportunity to engage with and interact, if he so desired, with the Jerusalem witnesses. And given the numerous points that we can confirm historically, not only in Acts, but also in the Gospel of Luke, that indicates to me that he not only had access to those witnesses, but he received reliable information from them, which is relevant to our case that the accounts in the Gospel in Luke Acts concerning the resurrection appearances and their content actually represent what the original witnesses were themselves saying. Acts also attest to the context of persecution, which is relevant to the sincerity of the apostles as well. There's other sources that bear on that particular issue as well as Acts, like the Pauline letters, Clement of Rome, Polycarp of Smyrna, and other sources. Even the Gospels bear on that discussion. So as far as the conversion of Paul is concerned, so Luke has even more immediate access to Paul, right? Because Paul he's a traveling companion of Paul. And in Acts 9, 22 and 26, Paul gives us, or Luke gives us these testimonies concerning Paul's conversion experience. One of them is in Luke's words in Acts 9, and two of them are attributed to the words of Paul in Acts 22 and 26. And so the conversion of Paul argument is a two-step argument for Christianity, which argues, first, that the accounts concerning Paul's conversion in Acts, and indeed Paul's miracles that he purportedly performed, actually represent Paul's own testimony. And there's a torrent of evidence to establish that. We've laid some of the groundwork for that by establishing the general trustworthiness of Luke, his proximity to Paul and his habitual scrupulousness, and also the fact he's putting his own neck on the line and so forth, gives us reason to think that he's accurately representing substantially what Paul himself went around saying. And there's also more direct evidence that bears on this, which I'll come on to briefly in a moment. But that being the case, we have to establish why Paul made that sort of claim. It doesn't look like he was lying, given the conics of persecution, in particular the fact that he was willing to endure such tremendous hardships and sufferings and persecutions and imprisonments on account of the gospel. And there's a torrent of evidence to establish that, including some of these undesigned coincidences, in addition to external confirmations that bear on Paul's suffering for the gospel, some of which we've discussed. And so then the question is, could he be plausibly sincerely mistaken? But when we inspect the content of the claim, it's not the sort of set of claims about which he is plausibly sincerely mistaken, because it's intersubjective and multisensory, right? He has this multisensory encounter. There's with a visual and auditory component. He sees a light, hears a voice. With him, he has a dialogue and receives instructions. It's also intersubjective, affecting not only Paul, but also his traveling companions who are thrown to the ground to hear the voice, so see no one, although apparently they do perceive the light. Paul's blinded by the experience for 3 days. He's later healed by Ananias, who receives a vision concerning Paul, and Paul a vision concerning Ananias. Ananias heals Paul's blindness. And then Paul has miraculous powers that he describes in his own words when he's writing to the Corinthians, which, bear in mind, included a contingent of skeptics who were critical of Paul's apostolic credentials. He says to them, "The signs of a true apostle were performed among you, with utmost patience, with signs and wonders and mighty works." He says something similar in Romans 15, where he says, "I will not venture to speak of anything except what Christ has accomplished through me to bring the Gentiles to obedience by word and deed, by the power of signs and wonders, by the power of the Spirit of God." And we see from Acts what some of those involved. We saw earlier, we talked about how Paul had a miraculous prison break in Acts 16, which is one of 3 prison breaks recounted in Acts. And Paul's prison break is in chapter 16 in Philippi. We could also see that in Acts 13, Paul actually causes a guy called Elymas, a magician, to go blind on command after he stood against Paul and Barnabas, seeking to turn the proconsul away from the faith. In chapter 14, he causes he heals a man who's been crippled since birth. I feel it greatly impresses the crowds. And the blinding of Elymas, by the way, actually is so convincing it causes the conversion of the proconsul Sergius Paulus. Right. So these are difficult things for Paul to be honestly mistaken about, particularly in aggregate. And so the best explanation then is that he really did have an encounter with Christ on the road to Damascus. And so the crucial aspect of that case then is establishing that the accounts in Acts concerning Paul's conversion and miracles represent what Paul himself said. And as I said, we've already laid some of the framework for that, the foundation for that. There's also more direct evidence that bears on these texts specifically. So, for instance, Paul, in a few different places throughout his letters, implies that his audiences know about his backstory, his background. Right. The most striking example of this is in Galatians 1, where Paul says, So this indicates that Paul's background was quite widely known among the churches, and so it would have been difficult for Luke to pass off a testimony of Paul that wasn't actually from Paul. But Galatians 1 is the most striking example of this, where he says, "For I would have you know, brothers, that the gospel that was preached by me is not man's gospel, for I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through revelation of Jesus Christ. For you have heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it." Notice you've heard. So they already are familiar with his background. "And as I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people, so extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers. But when he who had set me apart before I was born, and he called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his son to me, in order that I might preach among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with anyone, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went away into Arabia and returned again to Damascus." Now, notice this last phrase here, returned again to Damascus. Now, what's the significance of Damascus? Paul doesn't say. It's taken for granted his audience know the background, right? In fact, William Paley, in his Hora Paulini, notes concerning this. He says, in this quotation from the epistle, "I desire it to be remarked how incidentally it appears that the affair passed at Damascus. In what may be called the direct part of the account, no mention is made of the place of his conversion at all. A casual expression at the end, an expression brought in for a different purpose, alone fixed it to be at Damascus. I returned again to Damascus." Nothing can be more like simplicity and undesignedness than this is, right? Moreover, notice in verse 18, it says, after 3 years I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas. I remained with him 15 days, but I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. Now, notice that his visit to Jerusalem apparently got cut short, right? He's only there for 15 days, and he only has time to really check in with Cephas, that is Simon Peter, and the Lord's brother James. Now, Luke tells us about this episode as well in Acts chapter 9. And he tells us that in Jerusalem he just spoke and disputed against the Hellenists, but they were seeking to kill him. And when their brothers learned it, they brought him down to Caesarea and sent him off to Tarsus. Is it any wonder then that his trip to Jerusalem got cut short and he's only there for 15 days? A detail not supplied by Galatians about the fact that there was this assassination plot, whereas Acts doesn't mention the fact that he's only there for 15 days and so forth. So again, we see this undesigned coincidence in Acts and Galatians. Now, there's good reason, as there are for most of Paul's letters, to contend that Acts is not using Paul's letters as a source. I think probably Luke wasn't reading any of Paul's letters. But in the case of Galatians, there's, again, surface discrepancies. For example, if you read Acts chapter 9, it says, when many days had passed, the Jews plotted to kill him, but their plot became known to Saul. They were watching the gates day and night in order to kill him, but his disciples took him by night and let him down through an opening in the wall, lowering him in a basket. You would get the impression that he spent this entire many-day period in Damascus. But according to Galatians, he actually spent some of it in Arabia. We're not told actually how much time he spent in Arabia. It was an inconsequential period of time, maybe a few weeks within that period. But nonetheless, I mean, many days is an idiomatic expression for a longish period of time. So he's spending, Luke just glosses over it. Perhaps he wasn't aware of the trip to Arabia or just didn't think it was relevant to mention. But in any case, if Acts were using Galatians as a source, it's surprising that you get that impression as you read Acts. Moreover, scholars debate whether the Jerusalem conference in Galatians 2 is the same event as the Acts 15 Jerusalem Council, right? And there's arguments pro and con. An argument against it being the same event, for example, is that it would have been a very useful thing for Paul to mention in his argument in Galatians had they already arrived at the decision of the Jerusalem Council when he was writing. But in any case, the fact that debate can be had is further evidence that Acts and Galatians are independent sources. And there's other reasons as well. So, for instance, in Jerusalem, it says that when he had come to Jerusalem, he attempted to join the disciples, and they were all afraid of him, for they did not believe that he was a disciple. But Barnabas took him and brought him to the apostles and declared to them how in the road he had seen the Lord who spoke to him, and how at Damascus he had preached boldly in the name of Jesus. Now, reading Acts, you might well get the first impression that he's spoken to more apostles than simply Peter and James. Right. So again, it suggests that Acts is not using Galatians as a source, right? And yet you have this convergence between Galatians and Acts on these very specific details, which indicates that Acts and Galatians are actually giving us independent sources concerning what Paul's own testimony was. Moreover, in 2 Corinthians 11, we read about Paul's assassination attempt in Damascus. It says, at Damascus, the governor under King Aretas was guarding the city of Damascus in order to seize me, but I was let down a basket through a window and the wall escaped his hands. By the way, this is the same Aretas that we learned about earlier that was the former father-in-law of Herod Antipas, right, that defeated Herod's armies in a war. And but in Acts, it doesn't mention Aretas' involvement at all in this assassination plot. It only mentions the involvement of the Jews. These aren't mutually exclusive, but it does point to independence. Furthermore, in 2 Corinthians, Paul's laundry list of sufferings cannot be readily correlated with Acts. For example, 3 times I was shipwrecked. Now, as we discussed earlier, 2 Corinthians was written around Acts 20, verse 1, by which time, apparently, you already have 3 shipwrecks, none of which are mentioned in Acts. Acts as a different shipwreck in Acts 27, again pointing to independence. Titus is a very prominent character in 2 Corinthians, never shows up in Acts. And yet you have this convergence concerning this assassination plot in Damascus, which again indicates that Acts and 2 Corinthians are giving us independent access to Paul's own testimony. Here's one final point I'll make, is that the accounts of Paul's miracles in Acts also represent Paul's testimony. We saw earlier that in Acts 16, Paul has a miraculous jailbreak in Philippi, and we saw how that relates to an undesigned coincidence with 1 Thessalonians 2, which again suggests that this represents what Paul himself said to Luke. And that's something difficult to be honestly mistaken about. In Acts 13, Paul is on the island of Cyprus, and it says that he was with the consul Sergius Paulus. Now, there were two types of Roman provinces. There were senatorial provinces and there were imperial provinces. So senatorial provinces were seen to require less military oversight than imperial provinces. Imperial provinces like Syria province, of which Judea was a part, were under the jurisdiction of a legate, and then under those were the prefect, which later became known as procurators. Whereas in a senatorial province, it was seen that it required less military oversight, and it was under the jurisdiction of a proconsul. And in fact, Cassius Dio, the Roman historian, indicates that in 22 BC, under Caesar Augustus, Cyprus became a senatorial province. So he says it was at this time when he restored to the people both Cyprus and Gallia Narbonensis as districts, no longer needing the presence of his armies, and thus proconsuls began to be sent to those provinces also. And there's actually evidence that by the time of the Flavians, which began in 69 AD, the first Flavian emperor was Vespasian, that Cyprus already flipped back to being an imperial province again. So this is something that's easy to get wrong if you're making stuff up. I mean, bear in mind, the ancients don't have access to Wikipedia and Google and ChatGPT to look this kind of thing up, right? But he gets it right that there was a lesser number of senatorial provinces relative to imperial provinces. There's only around maybe 12 to 15 senatorial provinces at this time. And he not only tells us it was under the jurisdiction of proconsul, but he tells us the name of the proconsul, Sergius Paulus. Now, there's actually an archaeological inscription on Cyprus that bears the name of a certain Paulus, who was a proconsul during the 10th year of some emperor. Unfortunately, the inscription is damaged, but nonetheless, so we don't know the emperor's name. But many scholars think this is quite plausibly the same Sergius Paulus referred to here. Even if not, though, it nonetheless indicates that the family of Sergius Paulus was related to Cyprus and held the office of proconsul, which is consistent with what we see in Acts. Again, this is the sort of thing that's difficult to kind of look up if you're not well informed. And then Paul's very next port of call is Pisidian Antioch, which is not the most obvious choice for him and Barnabas to go after Cyprus. It turns out there's actually another archaeological inscription that bears the name of a certain Lucius Sergius Paulus the Younger in Pisidian Antioch. This is perhaps probably a relative of this guy, this proconsul, and so it's quite plausible. This is a little conjectural, but it's quite plausible that Sergius Paulus convinced Paul and Barnabas to take the gospel to his relatives in Pisidian Antioch. And so notice that this fits within a context where Paul is performing a miracle. He causes Elymas or Bar Jesus to go blind on command. Right? It says Paul, who was also called Paul, filled with the Holy Spirit, looked intently at him and said, "You son of the devil, you enemy of all righteousness," because he was standing against Paul and Barnabas to turn the proconsul away from the faith. So he says, "Full of all deceit and villainy, will you not stop making crooked the straight paths of the Lord? And now behold, the hand of the Lord is upon you, and you'll be blind and unable to see the sun for a time." Immediately mist and darkness fell upon him, and he went about seeking people to lead him by the hand. Then the proconsul believed when he saw what had occurred, for he was astonished at the teaching of the Lord. And so this is, again, something really difficult to be honest and mistaken about, even results in the conversion of the proconsul Sergius Paulus because he's so impressed. Final point is, in Acts 14, we have another miracle where Paul is in Lystra with Barnabas, and he causes a guy who's been crippled since birth to walk again. It says, "Now at Lystra there was a man sitting who could not use his feet. He was crippled from birth and never had walked. He listened to Paul speaking, and Paul, looking intently at him and seeing that he had faith to be made well, said in a loud voice, 'Stand upright on your feet.' And he sprang up and began walking." And this feat apparently greatly impresses the crowds. It says, when the crowds saw what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in Lycaonian, "The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men." Now, the use of a native language rather than Greek in the cosmopolitan Hellenized society in which Paul moved was quite unusual. But it turns out that Lystra actually retained their native language unusually. So Colin Hemer, in his book, The Book of Acts and the Setting of Hellenistic History, notes the Lycaonian language is spoken in Lystra. The use of a native language is unusual in the cosmopolitan Hellenized society in which Paul moved. Lystra, however, as a Roman colony in a less developed part of Anatolia, preserved a language otherwise attested in a gloss in Stephanus of Byzantium. So again, this is something that's quite easy to get wrong and difficult to get right if you're just making stuff up. Because again, you can't Google this sort of thing. You know, what regions preserved a native language, and it says Barnabas they called Zeus and Paul Hermes because he was the chief speaker. And this actually is consistent with the archaeological evidence that Zeus and Hermes were the native cult, the local cult of Lystra. In fact, the fact that they call Paul Hermes and Barnabas' use is consistent with the ancient belief that when two deities visited Earth, it was the lesser deity that did the talking, right? So again, this suggests that this account represents Paul's own testimony, what Paul had said to Luke, right? Who had access to Luke. Luke had access to Paul, and yet again, it's something quite difficult to be honestly mistaken about. But we've seen that it was also very implausible that Paul was lying, and so again, it points to the reality of his claims concerning his conversion experience on the road to Damascus, and indeed the miracles that he alleged to perform in the book of Acts. Does that make sense?
And would it also basically everything that you just laid out also be useful in the sense of it's almost like he's being fact checked dozens of times by the other authors, and in every instance it's ringing true? Then would you look at that and go to, for example, 1 Corinthians 15, to where when Paul says, there was 500 witnesses of the resurrection, we kind of go, well, and all these other instances when he's fact checked, it's able to be shown to be true, so that increases the probability that this claim is also true? Or how would you connect? How does this connect to the resurrection is my question, I suppose.
Yeah, so this particular point that I just developed there is relevant to the conversion and miracles of Paul, which is an independent argument for Christianity of the resurrection.
Got it.
And because Paul's experience is qualitatively different from that of the other apostles, because he doesn't have the sort of tangible experience. There are vision-like elements to Paul's experience, unlike with the apostles. But it is intersubjective, affecting Paul, but also his traveling companions. Is also multisensory. It also results in his blindness and his later healing at the hands of Ananias. And Ananias receives a vision concerning Paul, and Paul a vision concerning Ananias. So it seems to me that it's veridical, even though it's not as tangible as the other as the resurrection proper encounters, right? So this would be an independent argument of the resurrection for the truth of Christianity. And there's other arguments as well, such as the Christological trilemma, messianic prophecy, and modern miracles.
I see. So you're just saying in light of all of what you just laid out, we can see that Paul actually having met the risen Christ on the road to Damascus is the best explanation for everything that happens after that in the record.
Yeah, exactly. The sorts of encounter that he testifies to together with the miracles that he alleged to perform, are really difficult for him to be honestly mistaken about. And given the context of the claim, in particular the context of danger and hardship and persecution, imprisonment and floggings and stonings and death and shipwreck, it's very implausible that he was lying. He also doesn't look like he was in it for the power, fame, and glory. For example, in Philippians 1, when he's sitting in prison and he learns that some are out preaching the gospel out of conceit and selfishness, seeking to afflict Paul in his imprisonment. And he says, nonetheless, because whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. It doesn't look like the sort of guy that's a narcissist who's in it for his own glory.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, that's super, super interesting. A lot of good detail there for people to chew on, to say the least.
Yeah, and this is just the peak of the iceberg. Literally, I'm just getting revved up here. I can keep going for hours and hours and hours and hours on this sort of material.
I get that feeling.
Yeah, and if anyone wants more detail, if anyone would like to have a personal conversation about the evidence of Christianity or engage with any objections, feel free to reach out to talkaboutdoubts.com, and I and or others will be in touch with you to schedule a meeting to talk about the evidences of the gospel.